This is a MiG-15 Beast, the standard MiG-15 production model. It's wearing the insignia of the Chinese People's Liberation Air Force. The airframe of the MiG-15 was versatile and could be adapted successfully for many different versions: fighter interceptors, reconnaissance, even ground attack and two-seater trainers. These versions varied in detail, like the number and capacity of fuel tanks and the armaments they carried, but all shared the classic MiG-15 virtues of toughness, lightness, and simplicity. MiG-15s were produced at 15 different plants in the Soviet Union in great numbers. 7,500 were built and entered service with almost 40 different air forces around the world. This is the Republic of Armenia, situated in the south of what used to be the Soviet Union. It's an area of mountains, valleys, and small villages. Between Tbilisi and Yerevan, there is a tiny village, quiet and almost forgotten, that is now called Tumanyan. In 1905, it was the home of the family of Ovanes Mikoyan, a carpenter who worked for a French-owned copper mining company and lived in this small cottage. Ovanes Mikoyan and his wife already had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, when their youngest child was born. He was named Anushavan. In 1918, he saw his first aircraft. He said, "It was then that I decided to be an aviator." He could not pursue this dream until 1931, when he was given the opportunity to study at the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy. Within just 4 years of his graduation, he was appointed head of the new MiG Design Bureau, a rise that may well have been impossible without the influence of his older brother, who was a leading member of the Communist Politburo and a close associate of both Stalin and Khrushchev. By now he had acquired a nickname, Artyom, and was embarked on a career that would take him to the pinnacle of achievement in the aviation industry. In the spring of 1942, the Soviets' first rocket interceptor, the BI-1, burst into the air. Its pilot said that flying it was like kissing a tigress. Very dangerous and no pleasure. Artyom Mikoyan threw himself into the effort of the war. But his bureau's fighter aircraft, the MiG-3, was not a great success. Its production run was stopped before the war ended. At the MiG Design Bureau in 1944, there was time to experiment with another new form of propulsion. The I-250 project used a piston engine and a jet chamber with a compressor driven by the shaft of the engine. It was the brainchild of Nikolai Matyuk, who would later design the MiG-25 Foxbat. The combination of jet and piston engine power was a compromise approach to the problem of achieving greater speed than piston engines could give. And to some extent it worked. The addition of compressed gas exhaust to the power of the conventional propeller gave the I-250 a top speed of more than 500 miles an hour. About 50 were built and entered service with Soviet Navy aviation. The real future of high-speed performance in the air lay in pure jet power. In Germany, the Me-262 was being developed and would be introduced into service in the last months of the war, creating a devastating impression. In England, Frank Whittle was developing his Gloucester-Whittle E-2839, which would lead in turn to the development of Britain's first jet fighter to enter service, the Gloucester Meteor. In America, Whittle's jet engine was being adapted to power an American jet fighter design, the Bell XP-59A. At the MiG Design Bureau, it was becoming clear that conventional piston-engined aircraft shapes may not be suitable for jet power. The MiG team set up a low-speed swept-wing design study and built a strange aircraft, the Utka, or Duck, as a flying test bed. It had swept wings and a pusher engine. It flew for the first time in late 1945 with the great MiG test pilot Alexei Grinchik at the controls. After a few modifications, it became a valuable tool for studying the problems of swept-wing designs. Allied intelligence reports of Germany's Messerschmitt Me-163 rocket interceptor provided strong motivation for further Soviet research on rocket power. But when the war ended, there was no new Soviet rocket interceptor. In 1946, the MiG Bureau developed a rocket-powered design called the I-270. It flew in 1947 and achieved a climb rate of 3 minutes to 48,000 feet. Even though rocket engines did not lose power as they gained altitude, they had poor endurance. The I-270 could only fly for 14 minutes. Rocket power was not the answer. Already, MiG and rivals Sukhoi and Yakovlev were working on pure jet design. There was no suitable jet engine. But in December 1945, a Kremlin conference resolved that captured German engines would be copied for Soviet use. When the MiG I-300 jet fighter prototype flew for the first time in April 1946, it was powered by a BMW jet engine. The production version was called the MiG-9. 550 were built between 1946 and 1948. They were powerfully armed with one 37mm and two 23mm cannon. Already the Cold War was beginning, and the NATO system of code-naming Russian aircraft began with the MiG-9. Two-syllable names meant jet power. If the name started with F, the aircraft was a fighter. The MiG-9 was code-named Fargo. It had the first Soviet ejection system designed by Artyom Mikoyan. Mikoyan was awarded the Stalin Prize for the MiG-9, but the stress of the project led to a heart attack. Another factor contributing to Mikoyan's stress was MiG's intense rivalry with the Yakovlev Design Bureau. Yakovlev is located just 2 miles away from MiG on the same highway into Moscow. During the Great Patriotic War, the Yakovlev Bureau was the leading Soviet designer of fighter aircraft. The Yak series of piston-engine fighters was outstandingly successful. Alexander Yakovlev was a figure of great power and influence in the Soviet aircraft industry. He wanted to produce a jet fighter, but wartime success had made his bureau too busy to experiment as MiG had done. Yakovlev decided that his new aircraft would use components of the Yak-9 piston-engine fighter to the greatest possible extent. In effect, he simply installed a jet engine in a piston engine design, locating it underneath the fuselage and strengthening the tail to protect it from the jet exhaust. The Yak-15 had a tail wheel, which was quickly found to be unsuitable with a jet exhaust. When the Yak-17 appeared, it had tricycle landing gear with the nose wheel housed in a bulge under the forward fuselage. In post-war Moscow, the air shows at Tushino Airport were a great attraction for the Moscow public. Here they had the opportunity to see new Soviet aircraft for the first time. Joseph Stalin's son, General Vasily Stalin, was commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District. He organized these spectaculars at which the new jet aircraft MiG-9s and Yak-15s appeared. Until 1947, severe restrictions were placed on pilots of jet aircraft. They could only fly straight and level and perform the mildest maneuvers. But as more familiarity with jets developed, these restrictions were lifted. Pilots were able to explore the potential of the new planes and enjoy the challenge of flying them. Joseph Stalin was intensely interested in the development of speed in the air. He ordered detailed reports on the performance of each new jet prototype. The introduction of Soviet jet fighters into service opened up a new world for Soviet aviation. It was a challenge for pilots, certainly, but a vast range of new problems: fuel consumption, engine wear, armament, and high-speed stability affected the whole of the industry. The large design collectives, scientific institutes and groups manufacturing aircraft engines and armaments were well placed to respond to the severe challenges of this revolution in power in the air. Aircraft design bureau heads were given the military rank of general. When they appeared on official occasions, they wore dress uniform and displayed their honors. Rivalry was intense. But in the late 1940s, with the Cold War gathering momentum, all these brilliant and powerful men shared a common goal. They were dedicated to the search for higher and higher speeds. The organization known as TSAGI, the Central Aero and Hydrodynamics Institute, is the Soviet equivalent of NASA. From the early months of World War II, the T-106 wind tunnel at TSAGI was operating at close to the speed of sound. It was the first wind tunnel in the world to reach Mach 1. Approaching Mach 1, the drag of a straight wing increases rapidly. A thick wing cross-section also causes high drag. A thinner wing allows an aircraft to approach closer to Mach 1 before drag defeats it. The MiG-9 and the Yak-15 both used thin airfoils, but could still not reach supersonic speeds. The real breakthrough in attempting to approach and exceed the speed of sound was the development of the swept wing. Sweeping the wings back divides airflow. One stream runs across the wing and another parallel to the wing's leading edge. The reduced drag of a swept wing allows speed closer to the speed of sound and opens up the way to exceeding it. But Soviet jet engines were not reliable or powerful enough to reach these speeds. In 1946, Artyom Mikoyan and engine designer Vladimir Klimov visited Rolls-Royce in England. They were successful in negotiating to buy 25 Rolls-Royce Nene and 30 Rolls-Royce Derwent jet engines, which were at that time the state-of-the-art in jet engine development. When they were shipped to Russia, they were copied, and a major production program was established, building them as the Soviet RD-45 and RD-500. But no license was negotiated with Rolls-Royce to produce the engines, and therefore Rolls-Royce gave no technical support. By 1947, Mikoyan had produced the I-310, the prototype of what was to become legendary as the MiG-15. Even before the test program was finished, the Kremlin decided to start full-scale production. The new aircraft was very different from the MiG-9. It had a tubular fuselage with the engine mounted inside. The jet exhaust nozzle was at the rear of the tube, so exhaust gases did not come into contact with any part of the fuselage. The heavy-duty landing gear retracted into the wing, and the skin was aluminium. Moscow in 1948 was emerging from the stress of the Great Patriotic War, but the Cold War with the West was taking over, and there was a sense of urgency and competition in the aircraft industry. Artyom Mikoyan was not the only designer working on a swept-wing fighter, but he was the first to make an impact. In December 1948, the first production MiG-15 was test flown. At the same time, the production lines were rolling in MiG factories, not only in the Soviet Union, but in several satellite countries. There was one constant characteristic of the MiG-15. It was tough and could withstand heavy punishment without breaking. Adjustments and improvements were incorporated into the aircraft as they were manufactured, and there were wide variations in quality and performance. It was a time of industrial expansion. Hard labor convicts and prisoners from labor camps dug the great canal between the Volga and Dnieper rivers. Nuclear power stations were being established. In this environment, the MiG-15 was not regarded as particularly special. It was simply another step forward in aircraft evolution, and it had competitors. MiG's traditional rival Yakovlev flew their Yak-30 in September 1948. It was unsatisfactory and quickly disappeared from the race. The MiG-15 was left to face one other contender for supremacy in the search for speed, so carefully watched by Stalin. Mikoyan's competitor was the successful World War II fighter design bureau, Lavochkin. Their LA-15 was lighter than the MiG and handled better, but its construction was more complex and labor-intensive, needing greater manufacturing skill. The MiG-15 began to arrive in operational squadrons in January 1949. For about a year and a half, the LA-15 was also manufactured and put into service, and the two were evaluated side by side. Pilots said that the LA-15 was better from their point of view, but the logistic support from the MiG Bureau for their product was better. After a production run of about 500 aircraft, the LA-15 was discontinued. The MiG-15 was left uncontested as the Soviet Union's frontline jet fighter.
We will return in a moment to Weekday Wings on the Discovery Channel.
This is the North American F-86. Although no one knew it at the time, the production version, the F-86 Sabre, would become the MiG-15's great rival for air supremacy. It was roughly contemporary with the MiG-15 in development. The prototype was ready to fly at the beginning of October 1947, almost 2 months before the flight of the MiG-15 prototype. It took off from the lake bed at Muroc on October the 1st. It was similar to the MiG-15 in layout, with the engine installed in the fuselage and wings swept at an angle of 35 degrees. The MiG-15's wings were swept at 36 degrees. The main difference between the two was weight. The more complex F-86 had a maximum takeoff weight of just over 20,000 pounds. A loaded MiG-15 beast weighed about 13,000. From the beginning, the F-86 was an impressive aircraft. It was fast, and before the end of 1947 exceeded the speed of sound in a dive. Pilot vision was excellent, and so was the aircraft's handling. But this was a test program. The Sabre's qualities were soon to be tried in combat. In June 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea, and America entered a war that quickly escalated into a major conflict. American B-29 pilots bombing the North were shocked to find themselves being attacked and their numbers decimated by cannon fire from stubby, swept-wing jet fighters bearing North Korean colors. The F-86 was called to Korea to counter the success of the MiGs, and one of the classic air battles of all time began. By then, the F-86 had been in service for over a year. Like the MiG-15, it had been through a number of modifications and improvements as a result of experience with early models. By the time it reached Korea, the E model had been introduced. It had underwing racks that could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs, drop fuel tanks, or rockets. It had been fitted with a new General Electric engine, producing 5,200 pounds of thrust. It also had a one-piece flying tail, which gave more control power, especially at transonic speeds. The U.S. philosophy on arming fighters differed from that of the Soviet Union. In World War II, and at the period of the Korean War, American fighters tended to be armed with 6 or 8 12.7mm machine guns. The machine guns were easy to aim because tracer ammunition allowed the pilot to adjust to the target, but their firepower was limited, and the pilot needed time on the target to register enough hits to bring the enemy down. The Soviets, on the other hand, preferred 2 or 3 higher caliber cannon. Aiming was more difficult, but one 37mm shell was capable of destroying an F-86. The first encounter between American jet aircraft and MiG-15s had already occurred. On November the 8th, 1950, an F-86 shot down a Chinese MiG-15. It was an unusual victory. MiGs could usually escape from F-80s because they could climb much faster, but the American pilot was able to catch one in a dive. The F-86 was a major advance on the F-80. Whether or not it was better than the MiG was still to be discovered. The MiG-15 Beast was supplied in quantity to the North Korean Air Force and flown by North Korean and Chinese pilots. It has only recently been admitted, though, that the Soviet Union was also directly involved in the war. An air division of elite Soviet pilots, commanded by the top-scoring ace of World War II, Ivan Khazhedub, was sent to Korea to gain combat experience and fought on the North Korean side. U.S. authorities discussing the comparison between the performance of the MiG and the Sabre in Korea claim kill ratios of about 8-to-1 in favor of the F-86. This is an overall figure covering Chinese, North Korean, and Soviet pilots. But the Soviet perspective is a little different. Soviet authorities make the point that Chinese and North Korean pilots flying the MiG-15 had 2 major problems. The first was that they were not well enough physically conditioned to take advantage of the maneuverability and high G loads of the MiGs in combat. And the second was that the Chinese language did not adapt well to combat commands. And in the early 50s, soon after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there were no standard combat procedures translated into Chinese. The small number of elite Soviet pilots flying for North Korea had their own language problem. They were not allowed to communicate in combat in Russian, so their presence in the war would not be detected. When the performance of the Soviet pilot against the American F-86 is considered in isolation, Russian authorities claim a 2-to-1 kill ratio in favor of the MiGs. The US military was extremely anxious to acquire an example of the MiG to examine at close quarters. The British Royal Navy recovered the wreckage of an early model from 20 feet of water off the Korean coast. It was shipped to Buffalo, New York, and intensely analyzed. But it was not a complete flying example, and in mid-1953, US authorities launched Operation Moolah to try and snare one. They dropped thousands of leaflets over North Korean territory, offering $100,000 to any pilot who would fly to South Korea and turn his MiG-15 over to the Americans. On September the 21st, after the war had come to an end, Lieutenant Roh Kun-suk landed this MiG-15 beast at Kimpo Airfield in South Korea to claim the reward. It was impounded, partially disassembled, and flown to Okinawa for a thorough flight testing program. Under the terms of the armistice, it was offered to its rightful owners, but no one came forward to claim it. An expert team from the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio flew out to Okinawa to conduct the evaluation. The chief pilot was the legendary Major General Al Boyd, at one time the head of the flight test program at Edwards Air Force Base. Captain Tom Collins and Major Chuck Yeager, famous for being the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound, were the other two. The MiG accepted standard Air Force jet fuel and oil, but the hydraulic fuel had to be made up. It was a mixture of glycerine, castor oil, and water. The instrument panel had to be relabeled in English, and the pilots needed to become familiar with the placement of the instruments. The originals, which were metric, were replaced by American versions. The team was accompanied by a large group of technicians from the Air Technical Intelligence Center. They checked the aircraft minutely before its first flight. The North Korean markings were removed and replaced with the standard USAF insignia. There was concern that the MiG may have been booby-trapped, and part of the technical checking process aimed to eliminate that possibility. There was a sense of urgency about getting the flight test program underway because of the possibility that North Korea might claim the MiG back. A special adapter plug was made up to connect a standard US Air Force starting unit to the MiG's engine. A couple of additions to the MiG's equipment were made for the purpose of the test. An accelerometer, not standard on the MiG, was added, and so was an external air temperature gauge. Preliminary taxi tests came first, and the braking system was checked thoroughly. The MiG-15 did not have a steerable nose wheel, and the pilot turned it during taxi by using differential braking of the main wheels. The brakes were operated pneumatically, and the system was fed from a compressed air bottle. There was no compressor, so the bottle could run out if the pilot wasn't careful, leaving the aircraft with no brakes. The compressed air bottle was also the source of emergency power for the flaps and landing gear. Captain Tom Collins drew the privilege of making the first flight in the MiG-15. On takeoff, the MiG easily outdistanced its two F-86 chase planes, demonstrating the effect of its lower weight and thrust loading. It also climbed much faster. On the first flight, the tests were restricted to low altitude and medium speeds. Behavior during landing was analyzed. Landing characteristics were found to be straightforward and fairly comparable to the Lockheed Shooting Star. The arrangement of the MiG-15's cannon on a tray underneath the air intake impressed the Americans with its simplicity and ease of reloading. The package held both guns and ammunition, and a new one could be fitted and positioned accurately by one person. Turnaround time between missions was therefore short. The MiG came fully combat ready, loaded with ammunition, so controlled weapon tests were possible. Al Boyd and Chuck Yeager explored the outer limits of the MiG's performance envelope. They put it through a series of dives from high altitude. At speeds above Mach 0.92, the aircraft became uncontrollable and could only be pulled out when lower altitudes and denser air were reached. What the Americans didn't know at the time was that the MiG's flight manual restricted speed to Mach 0.92. On later versions, an automatic air brake was released when speed reached Mach 0.91. As the tests continued, the comparative performance of the MiG-15 and the F-86 became clear. There was no doubt that the Sabre had higher top speed, but the MiG had lower weight and thrust loading. It could therefore climb much faster and reach higher altitudes. The MiG could reach 45,000 feet, 4 minutes faster than the Sabre. It had a ceiling of 55,000 feet compared with the Sabre's limit of 51. The Sabre's higher speed was neutralized to some extent because most operational combat took place at about Mach 0.7. In those days, the thrust ratio of all fighter aircraft was low by today's standards. Because of this, speed dropped off quickly in aerial combat. Not until the F-100 and the MiG-19 came along did the issue of transonic performance become really important. The American pilots also complained that the MiG's control system needed constant attention, and the heating and cooling system of the cockpit were almost ineffective, causing loss of pilot efficiency at extremes of heat and cold. Russian pilots find both these points difficult to understand. In Russian, the popular name for the MiG-15 is Samolyot Soldat, a soldier's aircraft, because of its friendly handling qualities. Russian pilots have to operate in wide climatic extremes, and designers pay close attention to the efficiency of environmental control. The Russian conclusion is that the MiG tested by the Americans had a faulty system. It's impossible to say which aircraft was superior. The MiG and the Sabre reflect very different philosophies about fighter aircraft, but overall they were very evenly matched. MiG test pilot Valery Minitsky said that fighter development should have stopped with the MiG-15 and the F-86.
We will Recovery Channel.
The MiG-15 was followed by the MiG-17. It was not a successor in a true sense, because both aircraft remained in service together for many years. In terms of production numbers, the 17 was even more successful than the 15. Eventually, about 9,000 were built, some under license in Poland and China. They were operated by the air forces of about 40 countries. The prototype of the MiG-17 flew for the first time in February 1950. It reached Mach 1.03 in a shallow dive, but then in another dive from 16,000 feet, it failed to recover. No reason for the accident was found. At first, the MiG-17 was fitted with the VK-1, the same engine as later MiG-15s. This was replaced by the higher thrust VK-1F, the first Soviet jet engine to be fitted with an afterburner. The angle of wing sweep was increased to 45 degrees, 10 degrees more than the MiG-15. It had 3 fences on each wing, as against the MiG-15's 2. The first operational aircraft were delivered to the Soviet Air Force in October 1952. Like the MiG-15, the MiG-17 appeared in many different versions. The radar-equipped MiG-17PF became the standard interceptor of the Soviet Air Force. The MiG-17PFU was the first operational aircraft equipped with air-to-air beam-riding guided missiles. Its radar aiming site was located in a lip on the upper intake. The control system was new. The elevators had an irreversible hydraulic booster so that the pilot would experience no feedback from the control surfaces. Western intelligence authorities had to wait much longer to see a MiG-17 up close than had been the case with the MiG-15. It wasn't until 1965, when a Syrian pilot defected to Israel, that the opportunity occurred. Shortly after that, a group of MiG-17s were intercepted by Israeli Mirages, herded to the ground and captured. 2 were retained and used to carry out sneak attacks on Arab targets in Egypt and Syria. In recent years, MiG-17s have begun to appear in even greater numbers as sports aircraft in Western countries, particularly the USA and Great Britain. This one flies out of Burlington, Vermont, and appears regularly at air shows on the east coast of the US. It's been stripped down and restored and given paintwork with a gloss never seen on service aircraft. The MiG-15 and the MiG-17 were vital to the MiG Design Bureau and to Artyom Mikoyan himself. They were major successes for MiG and established new principles of mass production and transonic design. Their success also brought the means to explore new design approaches and the motivation to develop new techniques. They opened the way to a future that would radically change the design of fighter aircraft around the world.
Coming up next, they're the fastest and sleekest around. High-speed fighters and planes on wings. Then excitement and adventure. Mother Nature goes wild as the animal kingdom struts its stuff on Wild Discovery. Only on the Discovery Channel.